My name is Donnie. I'm 24 years old, and I never imagined that a seemingly ordinary night would be the beginning of the most complicated story of my life. I have a close friend named Dimas. We've been friends since high school. We're very close. Almost like brothers. Almost every week I go to his house just to hang out, play games, or chat until late at night. Dimas's house isn't very big, but it always feels warm. Maybe it's because of his friendly family atmosphere. His mother, Mrs. Mira, is the one who always greets me with a smile. She's a gentle and very caring woman. Every time I come over, she almost always has a drink or snack ready. "Donnie, you probably haven't eaten yet, right? Mom cooked a lot," she said one afternoon. I just chuckled. "Wow, you really are spoiled when you come here, Mom." She smiled, shaking her head slowly. You're like my own child." Honestly, I do feel comfortable in that house. There's no awkwardness at all. However, there's one thing I've recently begun to realize. Mira's husband is rarely seen home. Dimas once said that his father works out of town and only comes home occasionally. At first, I didn't think much of it. Until one day, Dimas invited me to stay over. "Don, let's stay the night. We're leaving early tomorrow," he said casually. I nodded in agreement. That night, we had a long chat in the living room. As usual, Dimas was full of stories and jokes. Mrs. Mira also sat with us for a while before finally going to her room. Don't sleep too late, she said before leaving. Around midnight, Dima had fallen asleep in his room because he was exhausted. I went into the guest room that I usually used when I stayed over. The house was getting quiet. The hallway lights were dim, and the sound of the night wind could be heard softly from outside the window. I was almost asleep when suddenly I heard God's knock on the door. Knock, knock. I opened the door a little confused, and there stood Mrs. Mira. She was wearing simple night clothes, her hair a little messy as if she had just woken up. Her gaze was hesitant, as if she wanted to say something but was still holding back. "Donnie, are you awake yet?" she asked softly. I shook my head. "Not yet, Mom. What's wrong?" She was silent for a few seconds before finally stepping a little closer. Then, in a very soft voice, almost like a whisper, she said something that caught me completely off guard. Then, suddenly, she gently held my hand, and in a voice that surprised me, she said, "Don, you can accompany to bed tonight, tonight." I stared at her in confusion. Before I could ask further, she added a sentence that made my heart beat faster. "Darte, I don't feel comfortable sleeping alone tonight." "Come on, Don. Dimas will wake up early. I'll wait in the room." "Yes." That's when I started to feel that the night wasn't going to go as usual. I stood stiffly in front of the guest room door, staring at Mrs. Mira, who was still standing in front of me with a slightly anxious face. The house felt so quiet. Only the sound of the fan turning slowly came from inside the room. "What's wrong, Mom?" I asked finally, trying to calm myself. Mrs. Mira looked down for a moment and then took a deep breath. "I just can't sleep," she said softly. I still didn't really understand what she meant. "Mom usually has trouble sleeping when the house is too quiet," she continued, as if trying to explain something that was difficult for her to express. I glanced at Dimas's room, which was at the end of the hall. My friend's door was tightly closed. There wasn't a sound from inside. Maybe he really was fast asleep. "You don't need to worry," Mrs. Mira said again with a faint smile. "I just wanted someone to talk to for a while." I hesitated for a few seconds. There was nothing strange about her request. I often chatted with my friend's parents, but somehow the atmosphere that night felt different. It was quieter, more awkward. But finally, I nodded slowly. "Okay, Mom." Mrs. Mira walked first to the living room. I followed behind her. The living room light was only half lit, casting our shadows on the tile floor. We sat across from each other on the sofa. The first few seconds were very awkward. Mrs. Mira stared at the table while I stared at the off television. Dima's father hasn't been home for almost 2 months, she said suddenly. I was a little surprised by the topic of conversation. Oh, he works out of town, Mom, I answered carefully. Mrs. Mira nodded slowly. Yes, sometimes you feel the house is too quiet. Her tone was very honest. There was a faint sadness in it. I began to understand why she felt lonely. The night was getting late. Before I knew it, we had been chatting for almost an hour. At first it was about ordinary things, about Dimas, about my studies, about everyday life. But as the conversation went on, it felt more personal. Mrs. Mira chuckled a few times as she listened to my story. Her gaze also started to feel warmer. Doni? She said suddenly. Yes, Mom. She stared at me for a few seconds, as if weighing something in her mind. Then she stood up slowly. It's very late, she said. I stood up too. Yes,
I'm going back to my room too. But as I was about to leave, Mrs. Mira suddenly grabbed my arm gently. The touch startled me a little. I turned to her. The look in her eyes looked different than before, Ata. Deeper, more serious. Doni, she said quietly. Yes, Mom. She hesitated for a few seconds before finally speaking again. If you don't mind, you can sleep in my room tonight. My heart skipped a beat. What? Mrs. Mira hastily added an explanation. It's nothing. I just really don't want to be alone tonight. I didn't know what to say. My mind immediately filled with possibilities. This felt so inappropriate, especially since Dimas was my best friend. But before I could say anything, I suddenly heard the sound of a bedroom door opening from the end of the hall. Knock. Mrs. Mira and I immediately turned at the same time. Dimas's bedroom door slowly opened,
and a shadow began to appear behind the bedroom lamplight. My heart immediately started beating fast. For a moment, I felt truly panicked. My mind immediately imagined the worst. What if it was Dimas who came out and saw the two of us in the room in the middle of the night like this? I swallowed nervously. But a few seconds later, the figure just walked towards the bathroom without looking in our direction. From his heavy, half-asleep steps, it was clear that Dimas was still very sleepy. I let out a long breath without realizing it. Mrs. Mira also looked a little relieved. It seemed like he was just going to the bathroom, she whispered softly. I nodded, even though my heart was still beating fast. A few moments later, the sound of the bathroom door closing was heard. The tap water ran briefly and then fell silent again. The atmosphere became very awkward. I looked at Mrs. Mira, who was still standing in front of me. Her gaze was a mixture of doubt, loneliness, and something I couldn't quite explain. I'm sorry if you're uncomfortable, she said softly. I shook my head quickly. No, ma'am. I'm just confused. Mrs. Mira smiled faintly, but it looked a little shaky. Sometimes loneliness makes people do unusual things, she said softly. Those words kept ringing in my head. Lonely. I began to realize that I might never have truly understood Mrs. Mira's life. From the outside, their family seemed ordinary, warm, calm, and happy. But it wasn't that simple. A husband who rarely came home, a house that was often empty, and long nights she had to spend alone. Doni called again. I looked at her. Yes, ma'am. She took a deep breath before saying, I know you're Dimas's friend. I know this might feel strange for you. I didn't answer, just listened. But you're a good person. And since you first started coming to this house, I've always felt like it's become more alive. Vampama. Her words left me speechless. I never thought my presence could mean that much to someone. But on the other hand, my mind was also filled with guilt. Dimas is my best friend. I shouldn't do anything that could ruin that relationship. I don't want any misunderstandings, Mom, I finally said carefully. Mrs. Mira stared at me for a long time, then nodded slowly. She understood. The atmosphere was quiet again. From the direction of the bathroom came the sound of the door opening. I immediately reflexively stepped slightly away from Mrs. Mira. A few seconds later, Dimas walked back to his room without saying anything. He didn't even notice us in the living room. After the door closed again, I looked at Mrs. Mira again. I think I should go back to the guest room, Mom, I said quietly. She didn't answer immediately. A few seconds later, she just smiled faintly. Maybe it was for the best. I nodded, then walked back to the guest room with slow steps. But that night, I couldn't sleep at all. My mind kept replaying everything that happened in the living room earlier. Mrs. Mira's gaze, her lonely tone of voice, and her requests that still felt hanging between us. I realized one thing. From that night on, our relationship would never be completely the same again. And what scared me most was that I, myself, wasn't sure if I was strong enough to keep the distance as I should have. I stared at the message from Mrs. Rena for a long time, until finally the phone in my hand felt warm from holding it for too long. I need you to come tonight, this. I really didn't know who else to tell. The sentence kept spinning in my head. There was something different about the way Barina wrote it. It wasn't like usual. There was a sense of desperation that was so palpable. That night, after much thought, I finally decided to go to her house. The sky was already dark when I arrived in front of Mrs. Rena's house. The house looked deserted. The living room lights were dim, giving a strange sense of silence. I knocked gently on the door. Knock, knock, knock. Not long after, the door opened. Mrs. Rena was standing there. She was wearing a simple house dress. Her hair was a little messy, as if she had been crying. Her eyes looked puffy. "Come in," she said softly. I stepped inside with mixed feelings. The living room was quiet. There was no television sound like usual. In fact, the house felt colder than usual. "Adit's not here?" I was cautious. "Adit's out of town with his father," she answered briefly. That answer made my heart suddenly beat faster. We sat facing each other on the sofa. Mrs. Rena looked down for a long time, as if she was arranging the words in her head. "I've actually wanted to tell you a story for a long time," she said. Finally, I nodded slowly. "There's what, Mom." She took a deep breath. My household hasn't been well for a long time. I fell silent. Mrs. Rena looked at me with eyes full of fatigue. Adit's father hasn't been home for almost a year. Even when he does, he's like a stranger. Her voice trembled. I felt alone in this house. I didn't know what to say. I'd always seen Adit's family as harmonious. I never thought there would be this big problem behind it. Mrs. Rena lowered her head again. Sometimes I felt like I wasn't even there. The atmosphere became very quiet. The night breeze blew softly through the slightly open window. Suddenly, Mrs. Rena said softly, "That's why I'm happy when you come here." I was a little surprised to hear that, because the house felt alive again. She continued, my heart beating faster. She then looked at me with a look that I found difficult to interpret. A different look. "Sorry if I ask you to come too often," he said. I shook my head quickly. "It's okay, ma'am."
I'm glad to be here too. Mrs. Rena smiled faintly, but the smile looked fragile. A few seconds later, she stood up. "You must be tired. Want some tea?" "Sure, ma'am." She walked to the kitchen. I waited in the living room, trying to calm my thoughts that were starting to get chaotic. A few minutes later, she returned, with 2 cups of warm tea. She sat on the same sofa as me, but this time, she was much closer. I could smell the scent of soap from her body. My hand started to feel stiff. We drank tea in silence, until suddenly Mrs. Rena said softly, "You know, I've been having trouble sleeping lately." I turned my head. "Why, ma'am?" She smiled faintly, but her eyes looked tired. "Too much on my mind." She stared at her teacup for a moment, then said in a tone that surprised me a little, "Sometimes I wish I had someone to accompany me to chat until night." I didn't know what to answer. The atmosphere in the room suddenly felt different, quieter, heavier. Mrs. Rena then stood up again. I took a blanket first. The air tonight was cold. She walked to the bedroom. I sat alone in the living room guest, trying to catch her breath. Something felt strange tonight. A few minutes later, Mrs. Rena returned. However, this time she didn't just bring a blanket. She also brought a pillow. She placed it on the sofa. I frowned. "Mom," Mrs. Rena smiled softly, "if you don't mind, accompany me to chat a little longer tonight." I still didn't fully understand what she meant, until finally she said something that made my heart almost stop. "If you're tired, you can rest here too." She paused for a moment and then looked at me deeply. "Just accompany me tonight. I really don't want to be alone." I froze in place, not knowing what to say, because that's when I realized tonight might be the night that changes everything in my life. Those words kept ringing in my head as I sat on the sofa in Verina's living room. The night air was getting colder, but what made my body tremble wasn't the wind coming in through the window, but the situation unfolding before my eyes. Mrs. Rena sat not far from me. The blanket she had brought earlier was now on her lap. She had deliberately dimmed the lights in the living room, making the atmosphere feel very quiet and awkward. I swallowed. "Mom, I think it's getting late," I said carefully. However, Mrs. Rena didn't answer right away. She just stared at the floor for a long time, as if holding back something she'd been keeping inside. "I know you must find this strange," she said quietly. I fell silent. "But you have no idea how quiet this house is every night," she continued in a trembling voice, lifting her face, her eyes moist again. I'd felt alone for too long. My chest felt tight hearing her. On one hand, I felt sorry for her. She did look very fragile that night. Not like Mrs. Rena, who was usually cheerful when we were hanging out with Adit. But on the other hand, a huge sense of guilt hit me. Adit was my best friend. This house was my best friend's house, and the woman sitting in front of me was his mother. "I just wanted someone to talk to," Mrs. Rena said again, trying to smile. Nothing more. But somehow, those words made the situation feel even more difficult. I tried to calm myself. "Ma'am, maybe I should just go home. I can come back tomorrow if you need someone to talk to." The words came out very carefully. However, Mrs. Rena's reaction surprised me. She suddenly held my hand. Her touch was warm. I froze. "Please don't go now," she said softly. Her eyes were pleading. "Just stay with me for a little while." I didn't know what to do. My heart felt like it was being pulled in two different directions. On one hand, I wanted to get out of this house before things got more complicated. But on the other, I saw a woman who was truly devastated by loneliness. Verena slowly let go of my hand. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to make you uncomfortable," she said, looking down. Seeing that, my heart felt even worse. I was just too tired of going through everything alone. I took a deep breath. "Okay."
"Mom, I'll chat with you for a while." Mrs. Rena looked at me again. For the first time that night, she smiled more sincerely. "Thank you." We finally sat back down on the sofa. But this time, we were a little further apart. I was happy to keep my distance. We started chatting about many things. About Adit's childhood, about Buena's life before marriage, even about her dream of starting her own small business. Time passed without me realizing it. The clock on the wall showed it was almost midnight. The atmosphere became more relaxed. But in the middle of the conversation, Mrs. Rena suddenly said something that made me fall silent again. Do you know Adit is lucky to have a friend like you? Danaki. I smiled slightly. Not really, Mom. But it's true, she said seriously. She stared at me for a long moment. Sometimes I think if Adit's father had a heart like yours, I wouldn't know what to say. Then Mrs. Rena stood up. I got some water first. She walked to the kitchen. I let out a long sigh when she was no longer in the room. My mind was in complete disarray. I felt like I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. A few minutes later, Barina returned with 2 glasses of water. But as she walked back into the living room, my phone suddenly rang. The name that appeared on the screen made my heart beat faster. Adit, my best friend. I stared at the screen in panic. Mrs. Rena saw it too. She stopped walking. The atmosphere became tense again. Just pick it up, she said quietly. I hesitated for a few seconds, but finally I answered the call. Hello, Dit. Adit's voice came clearly from the other end. Bro, where are you? I swallowed hard. My eyes accidentally met Barina's gaze, who was standing a few steps in front of me. That second felt very long. Because I knew the answer I would say now could determine how everything would end. My hands felt cold as I held the phone. My heart was beating fast, as if counting the seconds that felt so slow. In front of me, Mrs. Rena was still standing holding 2 glasses of water. Her gaze was fixed on me, full of anxiety and fear that she couldn't hide. Meanwhile, from the phone, Adit's voice came again. Bro, are you still there? I took a deep breath. In that moment, I realized one thing. I can't lie to my best friend, and I'm at your house, Dit. I answered finally. A few seconds of silence. In my house. Adie's voice sounded a little surprised. Yes. What are you doing? I glanced at Mrs. Rena. She looked increasingly tense. But this time I chose to be honest. I stopped by earlier and happened to meet your mother. We were just chatting. On the other end of the phone, Adit was silent for quite a while. Seriously, just chatting? Yes. Silence fell again for a few seconds. Then Adit sighed. Okay, I'm just worried. My mom has been looking sad a lot lately. I looked at Barina. Her face changed. There was a deep sadness there. I said softly. Yeah, I think you should come home more often. Why? I swallowed. Because your mom looks so lonely. On the other end, Adit fell silent again. A few seconds later, he spoke in a softer voice. I know. That's why I'm thinking about coming home this week. I was a little relieved to hear that. Good, bro. Yeah, thanks for stopping by and keeping my mom company. I smiled. A little. She's my parent, too. The call finally ended. I lowered my phone slowly. The room was silent again. Mrs. Rena was still standing in the same place. However, this time her eyes were really wet. You told Adit all that. I nodded. Yes, Mom. She looked down. A few seconds later, her tears really fell. I'm a bad mother, huh? I immediately shook my head. No, Mom. But I almost did something wrong. I got up from the sofa. Everyone can feel tired and lonely, I said softly. But Mom still stopped before it was too late. Buena wiped her tears. I was ashamed of myself. I shook my head again. The important thing was that Mom wasn't alone now. She looked at me. What do you mean? Adit said he'll be home this week. Burina's face changed. Really? She nodded. She was worried about Mom. Burina's tears fell again. But this time, not from despair, but from hope. Badaj kami sene. She slowly sat down on the sofa. I've kept it all to myself far too long, he said, softly. Sometimes I forget that I still have a son who cares. I sat back down. That night we finally, really, just talked not about loneliness anymore, but about how to fix everything. We thought about the relationship between a mother and son who had felt distant, and about how someone can almost get lost but still be able to return before it's too late. A few days later, Adit really came home. When I came to his house again, the atmosphere in the house felt very different. Livelier. Warmer. Mrs. Rina looked much happier. Adit also seemed to be home more often. Before I went home, Mrs. Rina had time to say something to me. Thank you for reminding me that night. I smiled. Sometimes, all we need is someone who is honest. She nodded. And I'm grateful that person is you. I walked out of that house feeling much lighter. The night that almost destroyed everything turned out to be the night that saved everything. Because in the end, I learned one important thing. Loneliness can make someone almost lost. But honesty can bring us back home.